Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Good evening and welcome to Wentworth Woodhouse and tonight's lecture, brilliantly titled Country Houses and Politics in the 18th Century. Now, normally we have one lecturer per lecture. Tonight we have three incredible speakers, and I've got to introduce them individually. They're each going to do a part of tonight's lecture. Jon Stobart is Professor of History at Manchester Metropolitan University. His research focuses on consumption and material culture in the country house, as well as being one of the editors of Politics and the English Country House, which is a book which you can have a look at the back. You can actually buy that tonight. He recently published Comfort and the 18th Century Country House. I would love to read that because I imagine they weren't particularly comfortable. Or maybe they were. I have to read the book. And he's currently working on an edited volume on global goods in historic houses across the world. Our second speaker, noticeable because he is resplendently attired, is Peter Lindfield. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquarians of London and a lecturer in history and the country house at Manchester Metropolitan University and architectural history at the University of Liverpool. He's also co-editor of Politics and the English Country House, and his second monograph, Unbuilt Strawberry Hill, has just been published by Sean Tyas. Now, you have to Google Sean Tyas if you'd like a copy of that one, which I am going to do after this lecture. And finally, Ollie Cox. Now, Dr. Ollie Cox has presented here before. He did a wonderful lecture on horse racing in Georgian England. He's head of academic partnerships at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and is in charge of the museum's work with universities in the UK and also overseas. Also a co-editor of, not a co-editor of said book, but he has a connection with said book. On our online audience, we've got nearly 50 people online tonight, and actually that grows as we put the lecture out on YouTube. We've also got Joan Kutu, who apparently Ollie met in a pub one day in 2017 and came up with a brilliant idea for the book that's at the back of the room, which is also the subject of tonight's lecture. So if you'd like to put your hands together, please, for our first speaker, Jon Stobart.
Good. It's going really well. Okay, so in a way, the really obvious place to start almost any talk about the English country house, and I think particularly one that has a kind of a political angle, is with Mark Girouard's book, 1978, which I tell my students, yes, of course, it was a long time before you were born, but, you know, it's still worth reading. And I think it's particularly important in this context because what it does is mark out the country house as, in his phrase, a powerhouse. And it's a really useful idea, a really useful phrase, because it tells us such a lot about what the country house was for, what it was about. It marked the permanence of the family. It marked the link to land, to the estate. But it also was, again, a phrase that he coined, an index of ambition. It showed how much they wanted to make a mark, where they wanted to get to, how important they felt they were and should be. And we can think there of Walpole's Houghton, Verney's house at Claydon, and of course here at Wentworth Woodhouse and what Rockingham was doing. These are grand houses that are making a powerful statement. And it's important that those statements are kind of unpacked in ways that are revealing of the cultural, the social, the economic, and I think the political power that they embodied. So I'm just going to say a word or two about each of those.
Is it possible?
Begin with the idea of cultural power, if you like. And particularly important here is the idea of the country house as a treasure house. Because what they marked was the taste of the owner, the taste of this kind of elite aristocracy, but also the ability of those individuals and that group to impress their taste on the rest of society. It's their taste that marked the kind of the gold standard, if you like. That was what everybody else had to come up to as a mark. And that was achieved, of course, through architecture, which Peter will say a little bit more about later on, but also the contents. And there's a whole series of books and indeed television series that are exploring this idea of a treasure house, the country house as full of important artistic, cultural items that display the good taste, the knowledge, the discernment of the owner. Often that comes in terms of collections, but also we can see it in terms of individual items. And treasure house is a really useful phrase because I think it communicates the economic importance, their treasure in that sense, but also the cultural importance. They are to be treasured. They're valuable because they're part of, increasingly, a national heritage. And that's really important, that what the aristocracy do, particularly in the 18th century, is project their taste, their culture as national culture and a kind of, therefore, a national heritage. And the houses and their contents, therefore, become integral parts of that national heritage. Oops. If we turn to social and economic power and the way in which the country house communicates those things, the most obvious statement, of course, is the sheer size and therefore the cost of constructing the country house. Somewhere like Wentworth Woodhouse makes a huge statement. A statement of permanence, a statement of wealth, and a statement of intent. They're built to impress, they're built to dominate the surrounding area, but also to dominate or rival fellow aristocrats, maybe neighbours, maybe elsewhere in the country. They're a statement of power, a statement of ambition. That said, a lot of the work that's been done on the social and economic aspects of the country house have taken a rather different focus just recently. There's much more interest in what people did in the country house. The country house as a lived space, places where families lived, where servants lived. And the working practices, work in terms of what the servants are doing, but in a sense also in terms of what the owners are doing. They're often talking about their work and how busy they are. So it may seem like a life of leisure, but equally it is a life where there is a lot of work to be done. The practicalities of owning, of running a country house. We know about those these days because there's a constant problem of funding to keep places going. 'Twas ever and so. There's a regular and large maintenance bill that's always needing to be met in terms of painters, plumbers, glaziers, etc. There's an increasing interest in the role that women play in the country house, and especially in terms of their shaping of the sort of social life within the country house. In terms of the economy, or the economics of the country house, consumption is one aspect that has come to the fore, maybe as a sort of an alternative to thinking about collecting, but particularly to focus on the kind of the mundane and the everyday. The economics of how a garden is kept going. And Roderick Floud has recently published an excellent book on sorry, we seem to have skipped onto a completely different slide. Right. No, we've just lost a lot of slides. There we go. Never mind. There's some really nice slides here. Never mind. Apologies for that. Never mind. So Roderick Floud has published a really interesting, important book about the economics of the garden, both in terms of the construction and maintenance. Here's where we get to the next slide, because one of the things that the economic perspective on the country house focuses on in particular are the ways in which things came to the house, the supply systems that fed into the country house and that made it what it is. Some of those, of course, are local, some of them are national, and the importance of London as a supply point for country houses should not be underestimated. But of course, a lot of these things came from across the globe. And placing the country house in that global context is a really important aspect of the politics of the country house. Putting the house in that global context makes it intensely political, as we've seen in recent years with the work of the National Trust in opening up some conversations about links between some of their properties and plantation economies, slave owning, and so forth. This becomes intensely political, and I think Ollie will say some more about those things presently, maybe Peter too. Clearly, that's true of particular houses, houses where the owner was an East India Company servant or a West Indian planter. And there the links are very kind of direct and very kind of tangible. We can see that's where they made their money. Here's where they're spending that money in kind of grand, elegant, culturally significant dwellings. But all country houses, indeed all houses, were increasingly filled with goods that came from across the globe. So everywhere, in a sense, is implicated in this global trade. The mahogany that the chairs are made from, the tea, the coffee, the sugar that is drunk, the porcelain that it's drunk from, the Chinese hangings, either in terms of silk or in terms of wallpaper. The list goes on. These goods are kind of assembled from across the world. So the country house is really the center of this kind of nexus of supply, reaching out all areas of the world. And that's a thing that particularly has been looked at in terms of, see if the pointer works, this book here, the East India Company at Home. You probably can't see it from there, so I'll read it out. East India Company at Home. Really useful, because it's available open access. You can Google it, you can find it, you can download it for free. It's a fantastic book and a fantastic way of reading and accessing books as well. And it tells you a really interesting story about a whole range of country houses and how they're linked into the East India Company, both in terms of the owners and in terms of the goods which they contain. Now, if the slide is there, splendid it is, I'll just finish up my section by focusing down much more particularly onto the idea of politics and the English country house. You were wondering when we were going to get to that, and now we've arrived. It brings us back, if you like, to the kind of the focus, the question that we were trying to explore in the book that's just been published. Politics of the country house have been somewhat neglected in recent years, partly because, as I've kind of hinted at in what I've said so far, those who are interested in country houses have tended to focus elsewhere. So if we're interested in country houses, we're not terribly interested in the politics of it. Political historians are more reluctant to look at specific places. They're more interested in the kind of the ideas, the context, the kind of relationships. They're less willing to fix them into particular places. But the country house is that particular place. The country house is where the politics of the 18th century very largely unfolded, and particularly places like Wentworth Woodhouse. Country house is political in its construction and political in its function. It's an expression of power, as Giraud said. And there's various chapters in the book that explore that. So Juliet Learmouth looks at Marlborough House in London and the way in which Sarah Churchill used that house to position herself strategically within the kind of the political, social world after she'd been kind of, after her fall from grace, if you like, after she was no longer Queen Anne's favourite. So kind of a political manoeuvring, a spatial manoeuvring going on in that house. It's also, of course, venue for patronage. That might be a way of attracting people in. It might be a way of pushing them away. And another chapter by Amy Lim explores the way in which homeowners, you'd think they'd want a royal visit. It would be a mark of their kind of standing. very often they're reluctant to have that. The costs involved, the disruption involved, and the ways in which they maneuver to avoid that, again, is really fascinating. Collecting and painting, John Bonehill explores the ways in which different political factions drew on different artists. So patronage systems that kind of separated off different political factions. Not necessarily in stylistic terms, although that is true to an extent, but particularly in terms of those kind of patronage circles. And of course, the house is the centre for networking, politicking. We think of Walpole's Norfolk Congresses, and of course the meetings, the sort of the focus of the Rockingham Whigs here at Wentworth Woodhouse. It's a central focus and a venue, but also a material expression of the values of those groups. And Joan Coto's chapter in the book really kind of drills down into the ways in which Wentworth Woodhouse reflects the values of Rockingham and his circle, as well as providing a venue in which they could meet and plot is not quite the word, but they could engage in their kind of politicking. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pass on to Peter, who I think is going to talk a little bit more detail about the ways in which the architecture of the country house has this kind of political significance.
Thank you very much, John, and hello. I'm pleased to be speaking to so many people, including a former MA student of mine who I feel like she's going to be disappointed that I didn't mention such stuff when I was teaching her. What I'd like to do is complicate our understanding of the meaning of architecture and the fact that architecture and design, so I'm looking around this room now at all the amazing plasterwork in particular, to look at how historians have thought about and contextualized the meaning of design and how that meaning can articulate political ideas, but also how it's potentially wrong or less straightforward than people have suggested in the past. So that's my way of decolonizing the political reading of architectural styles. So I apologize, I'm an art historian and my full art historical persona is clearly coming out tonight. So brace yourselves. So what's the context? It's generally understood that 18th century Whig politics, in particular opposition Whigs, had houses built in grand classical modes as we find here, based in particular upon the architecture of the person we see on the left-hand side, Andrea Palladio, who realized numerous villas in the 16th century in the Veneto in Italy. Palladio's influence came to Britain courtesy of this person on the right-hand side. You can see his name just cut off at the bottom. Inigo Jones in the 17th century. He cultivated a 17th century love for classicism, in particular Palladio's style. And it was manifest in particular through his engagement with Palladio's book, or rather 4 books on architecture, Quattro Libri dell'Architettura. And you can see the, hopefully if you squint, you can see all the marginalia surrounding the images. This is manifest. Admittedly, it's not quite as originally planned. Inigo Jones's Queen's House in Greenwich, built from 1616 as an H-plan building with a bridge connecting the 2 shoebox type structures to allow for the public road to go through the middle. So 17th century architecture, what's that got to do with 18th century Palladianism? John Summerson, that great architectural historian, wrote that the Palladian movement was essentially Whig. And more recently, Dan Cruikshank has also observed that Wanstead House, built for Sir Richard Child, who was a Tory until he turned Whig, in line with his Whig ascendancy, was one of the earliest and greatest expressions of the Whig association with Palladian design. So therefore, a nice, simple, straightforward building like this, Palladian in ethos, was in the 18th century equated with the Whigs. And we can see this in particular through the introduction and work of this, the introduction to Vitruvius Britannicus, or the British Architect, by the person on the left, Colin Campbell, from 1715. The dedication to the first volume from 1715 was to a notable Whig, John Campbell, the second Earl of Argyll. And in it we have three versions, progressive, of which has a clear relationship with the design for Wentworth Woodhouse. Three designs for Wanstead House as a princely mansion. So, like Wanstead here, many Whig country houses were built in a Palladian style. Nice simplicity, straightforward geometry, symmetry, so on and so forth, including the building we're in at the moment, Wentworth Woodhouse. If we were to go that side, you could see this wonderfully symmetrical facade. And in particular, one of the greatest expressions, apologies, of this is Sir Robert Walpole's house, Houghton in Norfolk, which was constructed as a Palladian style palace. As John's already mentioned, it was used as a venue for his political meanings. And the style of this building has been understood, well, its relationship with Palladian style has been understood, particularly to resonate with the political situation in Venice that resonated with 18th century Whig political thought. Fantastic. So that's great. That's a breakneck summary of generally accepted thought. So now I'm going to disrupt it. Apologies. Politics and political association did not guarantee the style in which political actors had their country houses built. Sir Robert Walpole, Britain's first prime minister, yes, he had this amazing country house lined with mahogany, you know, the product of evil coming back from Jamaica. It was not universal. All Whigs did not share this style. This is, apologies, small. I'm going to read it out. There was a trend in the 18th century for Gothic design. Gothic and classical were understood to be diametrically opposed. Only those of good taste liked, or everyone of good taste liked classicism. Those without taste or bad taste liked Gothic. Those who were intellectually deficient or something frankly was wrong with them, as understood in the 18th century, liked Gothic because it was fundamentally bad and wrong. So Alexander Gerard, a Scottish minister and philosopher, wrote an essay on taste. It's hilarious to read. I would suggest you give it a read. The 1759 first edition is the best, as it's slightly shorter. The second edition goes into a bit of unnecessary detail. He writes that the Gothic architecture appears extremely rich in point of variety, but its ornaments fatigue the eye by its confusion and minuteness. I wonder if he pays attention to the account here. Hence, we cannot easily distinguish one from the other, nor fix our attention on any one object, on account of the multitude that rush at once upon the sight. And thus it happens that this kind of architecture displeases in the very circumstances that were designed to render it agreeable. A Gothic style is to the eye what a riddle is to the understanding. The contemplation of its various parts and ornaments, the mind perceives the same perplexity and confusion in its ideas that arise from reading an obscure poem, or perhaps Vathek. Sorry, I've added Vathek in, doesn't make sense at all. The Grecian architecture, on the contrary, appears uniform. but as nature and the number of its divisions are precisely such as occupy the mind without fatiguing it, it has consequently that degree of variety that is pleasing and delightful. Side note, I think if you to look at the main entrance facade to Wentworth Woodhouse, that, really quite clearly describes, variety that makes sense, symmetry, you can understand it, you can read it. The Grecian architecture, whose divisions are few but grand and noble, seems formed after that model of the great and the sublime. The mind perceives a certain majesty which reigns throughout all its productions. Alexander Gerard's a bit more rude and I think makes an equivalent that Gothic appeals to those without taste, and he doesn't say dropped on their head as a child, but that's basically reading between the lines what he is implying. So an example that I'm going to illustrate is a house built for a notable Whig politician, Henry Pelham, who was the third British Prime Minister, third following Sir Robert Walpole. And I just want to chart out a few aspects of this building which help complicate our understanding of what Whig politicians built. I must say, the house I'm going to talk about, Esher, was built before he became Prime Minister. However, at the time, in the 1730s, he was still notable as a Whig, not the leader. So Esher has a long history. The first manor house was built in approximately 1331, and William Waynflete, Bishop of Winchester and Lord Chancellor of England, constructed a palace there, of which we can see a sketch of it. And they built this palace in 1460s, 70s, or thereabouts, and certainly before 1484. Esher, consequently, was this grand surviving Tudor palace, only a short distance away from Hampton Court, Cardinal Wolsey's great construction, until Henry VIII fixed his eyes upon it. It survived relatively intact until the later 17th century, but by the 18th century, and if I zoom in, you can see this structure here, this is all that remained, which is effectively the entrance tower. A gate tower. Fast forward, Henry Pelham acquired the land that Esher sat on, and of course he acquired the remnants of this Tudor gate tower. William Kent, that great early 18th century architect discovered by Lord Burlington in Italy, brought back, helped design Houghton Hall in Norfolk, came up with a proposal for Henry Pelham. Of course, what we see here is a pretty standard, you could say, particularly in the context of this building, modest country house on a knoll here in the foreground. In the background, we have the remnants of this Tudor tower used as a garden folly. So it's preserving it as a byproduct of history. It's nice, cheaper to leave it there rather than to pull it down or to build something else. There you go. Incidental. The actual the design of this new country house for Pelham was firmly within the Whig mold as found at Houghton or Stowe, for example, or here. But things change. We've got absolutely no idea why things changed. In dated design from around 1733, we get the tower, this Tudor tower, now at the center of the house. It's formed as the core to this house, and it's extended out laterally. Obviously, Kent, being this artist, draftsman, only draws half of it, so it's central, not tacked on the end. It has regularity. It's got classical bay windows, pediments, entablatures. It's plan. Ooh. The laptop is. I think the laptop needs some juice. Without images, yes, art historian without images. Oh no, yes, absolutely. Very much like Wentworth, it's got a symmetrical arrangement. So it is this curious hybrid of Gothic Georgian Gothic revival with Tudor mixed in, all bound together with this Georgian sensibility of symmetry. What I'm going to do is that basically that was my cue to stop, I think. What I wanted to do was just show a few images of the interior, just to emphasize, to hammer home the fact that for some reason, Pelham went full rogue. You know, this house. There we go. Excellent. Yes, full rogue. Amazing. Thank you. Full rogue. Well, not quite full rogue. The entrance doorway you can see here. Yes, nice OG arch, unnecessarily decorative. Here we go. With the incredibly curious decoration to the top and bottom, which effectively, well, it doesn't match an earl's coronet. It's just complete nonsense. It's meant to be cusps, but it's not. We have here Greek key and a classical type of clustered column. It's a bit of a mixture. The interior, we have Gothic rooms, this Gothic chimney piece on the left-hand side. It's Gothic in ornament, even if it preserves some level of classical sensibility. He went effectively full rogue, sort of similar, I think, to Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill. And even the classical elements in the design reflect not a wish to entertain a certain level of Whiggish sensibility, but the fact that designers, including Kent, had no idea what they were up to because there were no manuals on how to design a Gothic building. Henry Pelham, for some reason, went rogue, had a Gothic house on the exterior and the interior, which was the complete opposite of what we have here, with the fantastic classical facade, the classical elements in the ceiling here, mixed in with completely incongruous Rococo decoration, but that was typical for what Palladian buildings had at the time. Slightly incongruous, but standard. And on that note, I will take the computer's resurrection as a sign to pass over to Ollie, who will give us a taste of where the country house is at now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. And that was an amazing example of what art historians do for a parlor game. You know, imagine your favorite building and then sketch words. And I thought you did it magnificently. In my part of our sort of little sort of triumvirate this evening, I wanted to think about some of the challenges around how one takes a sort of detailed scholarly tome that sits on the table over there that we're thrilled with. It's many hundreds of pages with many hundreds of footnotes that demonstrate our incredible learning. I just want you to all appreciate our intense learning. And think about actually the challenge of seek to bridge the gap between big heavy tome sitting on a book table over there, and the day-to-day realities of opening country houses to a visiting public, and the ways in which some of the challenges that we're facing today about how we communicate the complexities of 18th century history to visitors that have different levels of interest, and how one might seek to kind of calibrate that level of interest. And I know, you know, with all of your collective expertise in the room of welcoming visitors to Wentworth Woodhouse over the past few years, how you have to kind of make that snap decision, don't you? Like, do they want a deep dive into the minutiae of 1760s aristocratic factional politics, or do they want to know where the loos are? And you have to make that decision quite quickly. And that's not to say, of course, that visitors sort of bifurcate into these two binaries, people that are either interested in the past or just want a cup of coffee. I think one of the really exciting opportunities, one of the exciting roles that somewhere as kind of charismatic and talismanic as Wentworth Woodhouse can do is take those visitors that may not have an in-depth understanding or engagement with 18th century history. After all, if one thinks about the national curriculum, it sits somewhere awkwardly between Henry VIII and Hitler. You know, it's you know, it's that thing that happens before Queen Victoria. That what one is dealing with is in general, a visiting public whose ideas about what it might mean to be a Whig is conditioned by the latest Jane Austen adaptation on Netflix. And actually, that's a really great advantage to us as 18th century historians and those in charge of presenting 18th century histories more broadly, because what it does is it gives us a touch point that we can refer back to, right? We can sort of talk about Johnny Flynn in the latest sort of like Amber de Wilde adaptation of Emma and be like, okay, so why is he behaving like that? Why is he dressing like that? It gives a kind of tangible connection, I think, to that particular minutiae and that particular moment in the past. So this is a way of starting by buttering you all up and saying, I think you do an absolutely magnificent job in trying to articulate complexity within a very limited time frame. To be honest, the amount of time that visitors can linger or want to linger in a particular space. And I think drawing on what Peter was mentioning, the other excitement around Wentworth Woodhouse from, I think, an architectural historian's perspective is that you've got none of that stuff that gets in the way of people understanding or engaging with the volumes of architectural space. It's rare to visit a country house where you have this opportunity and you are confronted with the architecture. In order to make sense of the spaces, you need that architecture decoded and explained to you. And I think that what that also helps us reflect upon are the kind of different educational trajectories that enabled this kind of performative architecture in the 18th century. That there are a series of codes, a series of reference points, and a series of kind of learnt intellectual moments in our 18th century aristocrats' intellectual development, which means that when they're walking into a room, they can be like, all right, yeah, okay, that's the Farnese Hercules or whatever. It's a series of visual cues that, not all of us have now. And our challenge, again, is the ways in which we as heritage organizations and we as custodians of these particular object histories, the ways in which we can help, audiences kind of bridge that gap. Now, one thing that we didn't quite predict when we started out on the journey of this book, we hosted a conference here in 2019 in the before times. The scaffolding was up. It was fantastic. Steve gave us a brilliant tour of the roof, and David was incredibly generous with his knowledge about the archive. We didn't quite realize we were just about to enter into a moment when suddenly thinking about the political position of the country house became a national pastime. So I've just pulled a couple of little illustrations to just help us think this through. An article from The Economist earlier this year: why is everyone so cross with the National Trust? And then a really brilliant, specially commissioned illustration from a really incisive article by a journalist called Sam Knight, who wrote a thing in the New Yorker. And it's always nice to look at your own country through the eyes of others. And I think there was a level of clarity and clear-sightedness in this article that was kind of really helpful, because it's that perspective you only get from sitting across the ocean going, why are you so angry about this? Or similarly. But I think what's very clever there is visually he's connecting the various threads and the various strands of global histories, in particular the histories of slavery that have come to really structure the way in which many of us are thinking about the histories of these particular country houses. And I think the fact that these properties and properties like, many 18th century properties were imbricated and linked to the slave trade, amongst other forms of colonial negotiation, colonial exchange, and colonial purchase, as John was mentioning in his talk. The fact that that has come as a surprise to many of us, I think, tells us something about the kind of political work that was being done in 20th century histories of the country house. The fact that these histories were kind of left out. And then for 50 years, the country house as a visitor attraction has helped forge a national consciousness that is quite has managed to forget the global nature of these houses. And I think what we're dealing with now is a reckoning of sort of 50 years of forgetting, as we're looking to to reinsert and remold these histories in a slightly broader light. So the country house has become a very political thing to think about within our present climate. But I think the other thing that we wanted to emphasize throughout the course of the book and all of the various chapters within it, and both John and Peter have touched upon this already, is that the ways in which the country house is political in the 18th century, there's a sort of sliding scale, if you like. There's rooms where day-to-day political correspondence takes place. I mean, the treasures that are the muniments here, thinking about the second Marquess's letters, the ways in which those are shot through with political insight, political intrigue. The kind of founder of 18th century political history in the middle of the 20th century, a German Jewish emigre called Louis Namier. Namier's whole approach to history relied on him pulling in sackfuls of papers from country house archives and sort of processing them through. So the very foundations of political history, one could argue, are rooted in the kind of archival collections of the country house. And I suppose one of the challenges then we have about narrating these political moments, these either ideological or intensely pragmatic decisions that were made, in theory, well, the written evidence would suggest, well, the published evidence at the time would suggest just by the men in the room. But of course, what scholars are doing now is really recovering the crucial role that aristocratic women play in the practice of politics in the 18th century. It very much is a kind of family affair. I think our challenge is often those conversations remain unwritten, and they're fleeting and they're fragmentary in the written text that survive. So in order to kind of animate these spaces, we've got to somehow rediscover that language of excitement, that language of exchange, as we're trying to work out the kind of big political questions of the day, which of course, you know, this place was at the heart of when one is thinking about the kind of the breakup of the breakup of the relationship between sort of mainland Britain and the 13 colonies of British North America. You know, that moment that catalyzes the American Revolution. Think of the conversations that were happening here with Rockingham getting papers in, you know, the advanced intelligence as to what was happening. It's really sort of tantalizing to think about how one might be able to reclaim, if not the actual words that were spoken, but the essence of that political engagement. And I think that's an exciting approach that we could experiment with in the ways in which we communicate the political essence of these spaces to visitors. Another sort of reflection, if you like, on the way in which politics permeates the country house is just in the contemporary language of politics. The idea of the cabinet, for example, a remarkably architectural term, because that's exactly where it comes from. The cabinet, that small, intimate space where you gather your most trusted advisors together. It has an architectural form. We could think about sort of backstairs intrigue. What has Nadim Zahawi been up to now, and how did HMRC not know? We talk about discussions behind the curtain, and of course the language of whips and whipper-ins. You know, the whipper-in in you know, that great Stubbs painting that didn't hang here, but is a kind of contemporary of the work here of Lord Torrington's hunt servants, where you have the guy with a massive whip designed to just bring people in. So I think there are ways in which we can use language to help address the kind of political essence of these spaces. And there are two final things I wanted to sort of think about, and John touched upon one of them in his opening remarks, and that's the challenge of taking detailed scholarly research that often exists in moderately priced volumes over there. I don't know whether there's a discount today, maybe there should be, but I can highly recommend buying the book. It will keep you warm at night. It's long enough so that if the electricity prices really get going, you can burn a couple of pages. Very high quality paper, I'd hasten to add. But hopefully you will enjoy it. But to John's point, it's worth reflecting on the the change in the sort of scholarly landscape at the moment has very much been about this idea of open access. So the ways in which publications can be freely accessible online. I just wanted to do a shameless bit of publicity here. The Paul Mellon Centre, the big funder for British art history, a couple of years ago did a project on the sort of country art in the country house. And it's all online, it's all freely accessible, and it has a series of essays that deal with both sort of broader scale thematic issues, but also a really deep and detailed dive into 6 specific country houses. And I think that's a really helpful way of framing and kind of benchmarking the work that you do here at Wentworth Woodhouse. And then the final thing I just wanted to touch upon are the ways in which political histories can exist and can be transmitted and can be discussed and can be communicated through particular collection items. And there are just 2 examples I wanted to share with you today. One is not an 18th century example. It's an example from 1868, the Congress of Berlin, which was a moment where Benjamin Disraeli, first Jewish prime minister, well, we can claim him as Jewish prime minister. Really does this sort of great statesmanly thing to try and provide peace for Europe. At the Congress, at the diplomatic meeting, think of it like the G8, well G7, sorry, because naughty Vladimir is not allowed anywhere near us. And all of the key members of the sort of the diplomatic corps sign the fan. You've got Disraeli and Bismarck signs it, various others. This then comes back to his country house, Hughenden Manor, and sits pride of place in the main sort of sitting room there. So there, in that, you've got a very sort of tangible manifestation of politics in action. You've got the object, you've got the provenance, you've got the stories that one can unfurl from that fan that links that links people, object, and place. Where this is slightly more tricky, I'd suggest, is using the examples of the 18th century family portraiture. These grand manor portraits that hang in many country houses, just using the example of the oak staircase at Chatsworth, because I was trying to think of a place that has a really like concentrated hang of these faces. Now, there are a couple of challenges I think we face today in interpreting these walls of portraits for our visitors. The first is that in their 18th century context, these exist as essentially a very glamorous piece of, it's a very glamorous Facebook, for want of a better word. What these portraits do is make manifest the family ties and economic connections that sustain country houses. And and these can sustain these houses across multiple geographies. So that's why they're quite interesting to track where various sitters end up, and in understanding that kind of aristocratic saliva trail, if you like, you can see the ways in which these families are linked through marriage and through economic interest, and importantly through political. What I would say today is one of our challenges in recovering those stories is the multiple ownership structures of these properties and the different cataloguing systems. So, the team at Chatsworth had their own, which doesn't speak to National Trust catalogues, which wouldn't speak to a Wentworth Woodhouse catalogue and wouldn't speak to an English heritage catalogue. So the work of the scholar or the work of the researcher now is how to aggregate these multiple data points, if you like, and to try and think about the ways in which we might use. So I suppose what I'm suggesting is that portraiture is a really nice way of talking about a political moment in time that we try and emphasize in the book around the politics of the person. And that's really how much of 18th century political work is animated. It's about being close to people, or it's about being related to people, or it's about falling out with people that you're related to, or it's about hating your daddy. Those would be my main ways of explaining it. Don't quote me on that, guys. But I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is that the challenge that we face kind of on the front lines of public history, which is really what I see country houses is doing, is that what we're trying to convey, particularly with 18th century stories, is a very complex political system that in many ways doesn't make a huge amount of sense now, because we do not have two readily identifiable parties. We don't have the Labour, we don't have the Tories. You know, and so to draw those kind of easy parallels, we don't kind of have that toolkit at our disposal. And I wanted to just conclude our remarks before we open the floor to questions by saying one of the outputs that we're really pleased will sit alongside the book is an online toolkit for heritage professionals, volunteers, and others involved within presenting country houses to the public that seeks to try and it provides a kind of glossary of key terms for 18th century political life and seeks to sort of direct you towards really valuable resources that are open and available for public use, with the idea that there's a sort of a reliable toolkit and resource kit that you can use when thinking about and trying to reinterpret aspects of the collection and aspects of the story here. So I think without further ado, we've sort of reached the end of our hour, 4 minutes ahead of schedule. There you go. But the three of us would be absolutely delighted to take any questions you have. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much. That was fascinating. Does anybody have any burning questions that they'd like to put to the speakers?
I love to the two words and so that was me.
Oh, okay. I can. Sorry. That's pay enough attention to my slides. Those are in the book, and what Elizabeth Grass describes, and I think the context in which those names appeared was in terms of the global connections of the country houses. What Elizabeth Grass does is describe the activities of a couple of St Kitts planters who take up residence in Norfolk. The names of them have just left me.
Someone's wanting to Thar.
So one of them is rather splendidly named Crisp Molyneux. The other one is Patrick Blake. And they were neighbouring planters in St Kitts. They came back and they were kind of neighbour-ish in Norfolk. So the point was to remind me to mention that at the time, which I forgot, so apologies. So the point being the ways in which these, well, we might term them nabobs, these kind of arriviste people, are trying to kind of integrate themselves into the society, the politics of the kind of the Norfolk and to an extent the national aristocracy. So that was Elizabeth Grass. The other one is Kieran Hazard, and he writes about the ways in which the family and descendants of Robert Clive work really hard with a collection of objects that he brings back, having obtained them in various different ways from his time in India, the ways in which those objects are used to kind of tell and retell a story that is about Clive, but also about the family. So I'm sorry that I didn't explain that at the time. Does that help you with who those two people are? Splendid.
Great question.
Gosh, so I think it depends is the short answer.
I was going to go with a 40
Very-
shilling freeholder. Am I making something up there?
I think the difficulty is that's certainly a qualification in some places. This is not my particular area of expertise, but it varies hugely from place to place. So there are some places that after the 1834 Reform Act actually have a smaller electorate than they did before, because previously they did have a really quite broad electorate. Elsewhere, of course, it's 3 people that got to vote, and it kind of switches around completely. So it's really difficult to say. There is a kind of a property owning qualification usually, but the where that's pitched varies quite enormously. Well, so no, they don't get to vote, but there's been lots of really interesting work on the ways in which women influence their husbands, or maybe their fathers, or whatever, into brothers, as to how they vote, and how the people who are canvassing are targeting women in order to influence how their husbands or fathers or brothers vote. So no, they're not voting, but they are very much part of that process. They're very much part of the intrigue, the activities, the treating, whatever else might be going on in order to secure votes. So they're very much part of that process in terms of who's voting, but also in terms of manoeuvring, as Ollie was saying, about who gets to be voted for. So the kind of politicking up at this level involves women, the politicking down at that level, and everywhere in between. It involves the women, not in a direct, you can be elected, you can vote, but very, very much.
And I suppose it's worth saying that within the political context of the House of Commons, say, where the big kind of landowners like Rockingham are interesting is they kind of control a faction of MPs. So I always think about a Tory leadership election, how you had people coming out from the Dean or people coming out for whoever. That's a really quite a handy way of thinking about the way in which a lot of political, the Whigs in particular, are organising themselves from the 1760s onwards, which is they kind of coalesce around key personalities, and those key personalities have at their disposal the opportunity to place people in parliamentary seats. So it's not exactly a transparent mode of government at all, but it is very much, as John was mentioning, it's very much tied to kind of property and land ownership and the idea of a stake in the nation. So that's whenever there's any narrative around expanded franchise, say in the sort of 1790s, everybody gets very, very scared because, if people don't have a physical stake in the nation, how can they vote with the nation's best interests at heart? Is sort of one of the answers. And they're looking at France, where everyone's head's been off, so they're also a bit tetchy about stuff. Yeah. No.
When you say
Great question.
Rather than down in London, or feel like
Great question. Great question. Oh, yeah. So the question was, how long are these kind of politicians or these people actually in these buildings like this out in the country versus in London with the sort of pleasures of the flesh, various other thrills that 18th century London does very much offer you. I'll start off and then I'll say if that's all right. So the one example because I've thought about Lord Rockingham quite a lot in the early 1760s. I mean, who wouldn't? What a dreamboat. Is that one of the real challenges for the older generation of Whig politicians? So the Duke of Newcastle, is he Pelham's dad or uncle or brother? Yeah. Yes. So elder brother. Yes, so Peter's man's older brother, the Duke of Duke of Newcastle, is the kind of the lead operator in the politics of the late 1750s. And he knows that there's this new generation of kind of the politicians coming up, which Lord Rockingham is one of them. The real challenge they have is that Rockingham is in Newmarket most of the time with the horses. And so Newcastle gets really panicked when it looks like there's going to be a change of government, because he can't get hold of Rockingham because Rockingham's out in Newcastle, out in Newmarket, won't answer any letters because he's got a new filly or something that he wants to break in.
Is that a euphemism?
Both reality and a euphemism. So his. Sorry, it's descended into parlor games here. But I suppose my point being, and you're exactly right, the politics takes place in a number of different spaces. And I think, the concern around sort of urgent matters of state often takes place in London, just because of the kind of proximity to the House of Commons and also to new information coming in off boats. Basically, that's the other thing, is thinking about the way in which news travels in the 18th century. You'll get the news a day earlier if you're down south than you are if you're here. And I suppose if one's needing to make a relatively snap political decision, that's significant. I mean, other venues of sort of political life that we might discuss. There are some. Yeah. So I think what you're hinting at, which is something that I think we touched briefly in the book, but could probably expand more upon, is that the kind of the geography of 18th century political life is really complex, and the country house is sort of one part of it. And certainly thinking about the way in which Rockingham uses his Lord Lieutenancy of Yorkshire, I think those are some quite interesting moments, is the way in which those big kind of landowners sort of activate those kind of significant local positions. And that's the moment where I feel these houses really sort of come into play at a local/region level. Yeah.
In terms of function, the houses themselves, clearly as statements of ambition, reputation, position within society, obviously they function year round, but actually as a venue to be occupied by the owner, families, etc. It's far less than how
We'd like to.
So a country house is not a house in the traditional sense today, where you generally live there. If you have a second house, you may go there occasionally for a week or so. These edifices were created and basically hardly ever occupied by the family. And if they did occupy them, massive sweeping statement, but the state rooms, these grand rooms, like we're in today, they don't, the state bed, the grandest piece of furniture possible to have in a state, in the state apartments, this suite of connected rooms, basically never used, if ever. Their design, their function, their use is actually visual, to articulate wealth, taste, connection with London, all these other things. They aren't actually used as beds. They're designed, yes. So basically, all these wonderful country houses we go to and think, gosh, yes, what a lovely house to live in. They weren't actually lived in all that often. Summer, weekends, if you're lucky. Plus, also, when the family was in residence, they would not actually be occupying the state apartments. Potentially, they would be occupying the family wing, which is an equivalent to the servant wing. And then also you have to factor in, not only families have houses in London, plus also they may potentially have numerous country houses dotted around the place. So it's these edifices are constructed as statements which can stand on their own, and you can visit them and pretty much like today go, oh gosh, isn't this pretty, or crikey, exactly, look at those portraits, look at those portraits, so on and so forth. You admire them, and so they stand on their own as representatives of the family, of the Oh, brilliant.
Great. The 18th century. Still is involved since 17 poverty. In the 20th century, they seem to perform a staggering country.
Yeah.
With London, like, you never had before. Are we now at the point where we have another country to make them bigger than
Can I lead us off? So I've got an example that this is ringing so true. Next Tuesday, I'm doing a session from National Trust at Cork Abbey, Derbyshire, and Cork is saved for the nation. There you go. I've slipped into that euphemistic language. Actually, he couldn't pay his inheritance tax bill, so fortunately, he could flog his bloody house. I wish I could do that. I'm sorry, not to sound bitter, angry, or anything, but exactly to your point. So Cork, the narrative around Cork 1981 to 84 is that, you know, this is a sort of it's the narrative is really interesting because they say it's the accumulation of stuff over 300 years that makes it significant. To Peter's point, they have a state bed that is, you know, the state bed there is never taken out of the case. So you open it up in 1984 and it's like silk that hasn't seen the outside, hasn't seen light in sort of 230 years. But what that's, and in the way in which the National Trust have interpreted that and their current spirit of place is that they say that the house is a sort of emblem, an emblem of a kind of noble decline. And I just don't think that's good enough. I just don't think that's good enough as a base, as a starting point for your interpretation that this house represents the death of a certain life, and that we're supposed to mourn is the other struggle. So yeah, exactly to your point. I think we're at a really crucial moment in time where, and I think somewhere like Wentworth Woodhouse is actually really on the front foot as to what the kind of new role of a socially engaged, purposeful country house can be that is charitably owned. So what I'm not saying, you know, and I suppose what I'm not really trying to talk about here is that, yeah, private owners never open to the public. I don't care what they do. It's their house. They can do whatever they want. But I think from a charity perspective and a sort of public benefit perspective, I really do think Wentworth is nimble and agile enough to kind of reinvent. It could kind of reinvent that. So that's why, obviously, it's always a treat to come here. That would be my starting for 10.
Yes, I think the country house presents a lot of challenges and also an awful lot of opportunities. Challenges, I think, first of all, in accessibility. So one of the things that's actually staggering, and Babette will back me up, is when we were last year touring numerous country houses, the variety in entrance fees, even for National Trust properties, adjacent National Trust properties, was staggering, absolutely staggering. And there seemed to be sometimes a complete dislocation between the entrance fee and the perceived quality of the house. I mean, not going to name names because that's a bad thing. But I think if you're a National Trust member, yes, you can go in, access it, it's for free. But in terms of trying to make these great structures relevant, and there are so many, even shells where you can install interpretation. They've got so much to offer all of society, irrespective of background, interests. You know, there's so much to offer. But by putting a price to, obviously there's the reality, but the financial aspects are really important. What we need to think about them to open up houses to as broader people as possible. In terms of the challenges the country houses possess, I think the current climate of decolonization, the country house is not just this lovely thing full of nice stuff that was expensive and collected by or commissioned by the elite in society. That's still clearly really important. You know, the quality of the plasterwork is really important. But the other aspects of the country house are very much like today, and Clive Adler makes this point in his book, The Story of the Country House, which came out in September last year. You know, who has one of these? You know, who has an iPhone? Or you know, these things are socially challenging. Where are they made? Who's employed to construct them? Is there exploitation by Western standards, by Eastern standards? You know, no one is guilty. No one is innocent of things that the country house at the moment is potentially subject to. But I think what this moment offers us is an ability to think about and reflect upon how global the country house is. The country house has been influenced by the globe, trade for centuries. Going back even to the 17th century, Chinese imports were incredibly fashionable. Chinese cabinets on stands, you know, they're massively valued. And whilst, yes, country houses and settlements have connections with slavery, slave trade, you know, mahogany furniture. Yes, mahogany is the axis of evil because mahogany was brought back on the slave ships that transported slaves to Jamaica. Mahogany was brought back from Jamaica as ballast to stop them from flipping over because they're too light, because they don't have all the weight of all the humans on board. So all the mahogany furniture you see, you know, the best 18th century furniture is directly connected to the slave trade. I think thinking about the country house as this sort of center for taste, for culture, for society is a great way to reflect upon society itself. You know, admittedly a certain demographic, but it offers us a great opportunity to think about how international British society was. And of course, we then have to, as Clive Aslett makes clear, work out the best way of trying to read the past and interpret it. Is it fair to interpret 18th century history by 21st century moral standards? Obviously, that's not a question I'm going to answer, but I think the country house gives us great forum to understand how, you know, the 18th century country house was not just connected to empire through obvious means, but many means that are completely occluded to everyone, apart from those who study something very, very specific. And I mean, I don't suggest saying every single piece of mahogany furniture should have a label saying this was, you know, this is a product of slave trade. But, you know, there are many questions to answer, but I think it's a great opportunity. John, over to you.
The only thing that I would add to those very full answers is that nice thing, not it is another way of getting an insight into those relationships between an English country house and this kind of wider world of goods and of investments and so on, is to look at country houses elsewhere in them. So what we are preoccupied about, how we interpret the ownership of certain goods. How are those goods seen in other places? How are they understood now? How are they understood by owners? So if we're looking at a country house and its collections of goods through a lens of empire, how do we understand those things in some of the German states? They don't have empire. They're part of empire, of a land, you know, kind of a continental European empire. You know, they don't have empire in that sense. So how do they interpret those things? What did it mean to the people at the time? And I think that kind of comparison across can be very useful in getting us to think about how we interpret what was going on in the past, but also how we might want to talk about that in the present and I suppose in the future as well.
It's supposed to know it's in the country of the US Army. Now, she wanted to talk about the behavior of the day. The idea, the timing, when you talk about opportunities to help you to clear, you ready know what this is going. You know, not for the next.
That's what Jon said.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the usual answer that you might give to that would be emulation. So you are copying the behaviour of those sort of slightly upper social scale from where you are, with an idea that somehow you are part of their world. Therefore, there are all sorts of problems with that as an explanation. But I think there's still quite a lot of validity in it when we see the sorts of practices and the sorts of kind of aspirational language that people use when they say, we saw the silver sconces that the Queen has. We could do with some of those ourselves. So not us, but people could. So there is that kind of aspirational. In terms of behaviours, I think we need to be a little bit careful, because there's ways in which we can see some of the objects, a lot of the objects in country houses, as in a way exclusive and exclusionary, particularly in terms of kind of art objects, because I've got it, you can't have it. You can perhaps have a copy of it, but actually even then I might let you have a copy of it, or I might not. So I've got power controlling that, and it's a kind of exclusionary power, and it gives me status. And that holds good for a lot of the things that we might find. The decoration in the room here. That's rather different from having a tea set and being able to serve tea, because we could serve tea maybe in this room that would be using a very fine set of probably imported china. Maybe it's Japanese, Chinese, maybe it's Sevres or Meissen or whatever. The people in the estate cottages can be having tea as well. They're likely to be using probably Staffordshire pottery. Maybe it's porcelain. They may have got it secondhand. Probably it's a kind of a creamware, an earthenware. So you can copy practices with, if you like, cheaper imitations. But there are a lot of the things that I think remain exclusive and deliberately exclusionary. That's kind of the point. There are markers of status, markers of distinction.
Yes, sorry, this is based upon the going into the staff wing in Kesselton on Tuesday this week. So the staff wing and the family wing are mirror images of each other set either side of the main block. The staircase, and this is where I think there's an interesting relationship between upstairs and downstairs. The staircase in the center of the staff block where the staff lived was staggering, actually. Decoration clearly pared back, but the scale of it, how large and open it was versus what was actually needed, it was massively over the top. I think that could be due to 18th century Georgian principles of symmetry. But there's, it seemed unnaturally generous for a space designed exclusively for staff. So I know it's design once again, but there's a lot of really interesting work clearly to be done on this.
So you said it all.
I hope that was useful. Sorry.